So he goes to Gethsemane, and notice anything about the agony of Jesus in the garden is missing in John. John does not want to show Jesus struggling. For John, Jesus is in control all the time. Thank you very much. Jesus is the one who hands himself over. Nobody is doing something to him that he has not taken the initiative to hand himself over for. So John completely omits anything that happens there in Gethsemane. It's interesting. John is the only one who calls it a garden, yet he doesn't have anything happening there. Verse 1 of chapter 18, he went to a place where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Verse 2, now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers. Okay? So, it doesn't tell anything what that happened there. The others, of course, go into a variety of details. And Mark and Matthew are very strong that Jesus is flinching before what seems to be the will of God. Jesus doesn't want this. And he tells God in prayer, take this hour from me. Remove this cup. But the bottom line is, not my will but yours. But notice, first he says, take this cup away. And he prays repeatedly that way. Now, Luke again softens that. Luke does not have Jesus groveling before God, struggling with his will. He simply says, Father, if you are willing. So he starts with the will of God. If you're willing, remove this cup, yet not my will, but yours be done. And then he doesn't repeat that. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. So Luke has God the Father answering his prayer. The others essentially have silence. Jesus has to struggle with that himself. Now, there still is anguish, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. Whether that was actually blood that he was sweating, or whether that was a metaphor for the profusion of perspiration, that's disputed. So it may not have been his actual sweating blood, but that he was sweating as if he was bleeding with that profusion. So you can take that either way that you really you may really want to. But that whole, he alludes to the anguish, but he doesn't really describe it. And then when he got up from prayer, he came, found them sleeping. And why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. One question that Father Raymond Brown poses is, how do we know what he was saying in those prayers if all of the eyewitnesses were asleep? That's kind of an interesting question. His answer, which I think is a good one, is that it was sure obvious, maybe not to them right at that moment, but it was obvious from hindsight, what was happening in Jesus' mind and mentality at that time. And they put the words of what they knew of how he prayed, they put those words into his mouth. So that he would be praying, launching from his situation. But he would also be praying, as he taught them to pray, "Thy will be done."
Do not bring us to the test.
And do not bring us to the test. So Father Raymond Brown sees a lot of parallel here with the Lord's Prayer, and that whenever Jesus prayed, all of his prayers echoed in some way what he told us in the Lord's Prayer. So it's a pretty logical conclusion, a pretty logical inference there. Let's do the arrest, and then beginning next week we'll get into the trial. John's Gospel does speak of the soldiers alluding to the Romans together with the police from the chief priests. The others was a large crowd, swords and clubs, from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. One of the things that is interesting that Father Brown points out here is it was the temple authorities, the chief priests, who actually were the ones who went out and arrested him. The Pharisees are not mentioned. The Pharisees were a very different group of people from the priests. The priests were the Sadducees, and they were the ones who were in charge of the temple. So even though Jesus disputed with the Pharisees, even though they hated him enough that they wanted to put him to death, it was actually the Sadducees, which Jesus did not dispute with nearly as much, and the temple officials, the chief priests, who never appeared in the disputes of Jesus before that, was the chief priests that went out and arrested him. Judas is leading them. He had made that arrangement for the 30 pieces of silver with the council, the Sanhedrin, and he gives them the sign. The sign of, the irony, of course, is that the sign of affection, the sign of brotherly love, is the one that is the sign of betrayal. Now, it is kind of interesting that it's the temple police that come to arrest Jesus, and Jesus' words to them were, "I've been teaching in the temple. I've been in the temple. Why do you come out at night as if I'm a robber, as if I'm a criminal? You could have laid hands on me at any time." Then, of course, one of the bystanders, one of those with Jesus, it doesn't say who in Mark and Matthew or Luke, cuts off the high priest's ear. Or the slave of the high priest, I should say, cuts off his ear. It's interesting that Mark and Matthew do not, as far as they're concerned, the severed ear just remained lying there. Luke's is so very much the gospel of compassion. So Jesus, in Luke's gospel, in distinction to Mark and Matthew, in Luke's gospel, continually, Jesus is exercising his compassion. As he is suffering this passion, he is exercising compassion. He is reaching out to those who are hurting, to those who are suffering. And we see that over and over again, and we'll have occasion to point that out. Now, I think it's in John's Gospel only that is identified as Simon Peter, high priest's slave's ear. Even gives the name.